Hey there guys, Botstowo here. Today what I got for you is a promising contender for the title of worst gas mask ever. Specifically, what we're looking at is the Potomac Emergency Escape Mask from Helsatech. Before we get into it, I just gotta say I've been sick with a cold for the last 3 weeks. All I've got left from it is a little bit of a cough, but if I still sound a little gross, I apologize for that. Anyhow, the YouTuber Gas Mask Bunker made a video on this thing about a couple months ago, but that focused mainly on why it's such a terrible mask. And I don't really want to step on his toes, so I'll focus on the history in this one. But don't worry, I will definitely still be dunking on this thing. But for now, why don't we just jump right into the history? So these things are manufactured by the PPE manufacturer Helsatech in Germany. And it seems that they were originally designed and manufactured as a direct response to 9/11. Because, well, 9/11 inspired a bunch of people to become preppers. The idea was that if such large-scale attacks on the United States were now possible, what's to stop it from happening again? And if it did happen again, it would almost certainly wind up being a targeted attack against civilians again, as 9/11 was, and it could also wind up being a chemical attack. Looking back, we now know that that never wound up happening. There was no chemical attack on the scale of 9/11, but at the time, that was a very real fear for the American people. So what ended up happening was a bunch of people panic bought gas masks. This resulted in the prices of a lot of masks that used to be commonplace just skyrocketing to hundreds of dollars even. And yes, it was way, way worse than the modern COVID pricing phenomenon. And so with this new massive demand, a bunch of companies sprung up to fill that demand. This, of course, includes the famous Everstar, who sold a bunch of Soviet trash, really, in those neat cardboard boxes, which I do want to get for my collection at some point. And also Chemsafe, which we've all seen that commercial. And if you haven't, I suppose I'll link that in the description. Among all of these various mask importers was not Helsatech. Instead, it was their sole, at the time, global distributor, IBN Protection Products. IBN remained the sole distributor for a few years until 2005 or 2006, when the company Elmridge Protection, which seems to still be around today, started selling them. And then in 2008, something interesting happened. There was an Ebola epidemic. You see, I was 9 when this was going down, so I actually have some memory of it. And, well, it was legitimately kind of scary. I remember sitting in my history class, and my teacher, who we had a very not nice nickname for, she would fearmonger to us about how Ebola's gonna come to the United States and it could, destroy our country. But since we are part of the first world, aka the part of the world where all of Africa's money went, that of course didn't wind up happening. But like I said, at the time it was kind of scary, the idea that, oh, what if this disease that's killing a lot of people over there comes over here and kills people? That's terrifying, So, naturally, companies like Elmridge started selling these masks as a counter to Ebola. And that's why I've got this little paper here that I will now show you. The first part of this sheet is just a list of arguments as to why you would use something designed as a CBRN escape mask against a virus. Up here, they pretty much say that, yes, these filters do actually work against Ebola. And then down here, they say that it's better than just a standard N95. Personally, I think it's rather silly to use an escape mask for pandemic response, but I guess if there's just surprise Ebola in your workplace or something, and you need to evacuate, then the Potomac is the mask for you. But yeah, these are essentially the same tricks that are used today to get people to use proper gas masks instead of N95s for something like COVID, right? The whole point of the N95 is its main purpose isn't actually to protect you, really. More so, it's to keep you from infecting others in case you are infected. Something like a Potomac doesn't have a filtered exhale valve, and I'm sure that you can think of a company from today that used these exact tactics to offload a bunch of shitty European masks during the heights of the COVID pandemic, but I'm not going to name names, and we're getting a little off topic. Anyways, lower on the sheet are your donning instructions, beautifully made in like MS Paint or something, and then the address and email and website for Elmridge protection. A lot of the Potomac's literature came with these rather wonderful MS Paint drawings, including this one that I'm about to show you. The final thing to note on this sheet is that it actually calls it the Potomac Emergency Mask 500. I've not been able to find any other reference to the Potomac that calls it the 500, so that seems like it was just an Elmridge thing. The Potomac wound up being sold from about 2002 to maybe the early 2010s, although it seems that by 2012, Elmridge had completely dropped this as a product in favor of the iEvac escape hood. It's not exactly clear, and I'm sorry that the only definite date I have relating to this thing is 9/11. It's just the problem is, this thing isn't very well documented. And this brings me to a topic that I wanted to briefly touch on. It's how much stuff has been lost. This phenomenon, of course, isn't restricted to just gas mask collecting. Instead, it's inherent to all historical fields. I just thought that this would be a good example of how this kind of information disappears. You see, this thing came to be in my lifetime, in the internet era, but we know next to nothing about this. That's partly because, this was and is a smallish company that probably discarded all their records of this thing years ago, or if they didn't, they're in a filing cabinet somewhere that, nobody's looked at since this thing was around. And it's also because, let's be real here, nobody gives a shit. Nobody cares enough to actually record all of this information down and publish it. Somebody's actually got to sit down and take the time to record this information before it's lost. And it kind of has to be the most accurate, the people who originally did these things. And I mean, let's be real here, they're not going to do that. When you're working at your job, if you have one, when's the last time you decided to take notes on the exact history of what was going down in your office, what products they're pushing out the door, with the purpose of eventually publishing that in a book or a journal or something? You don't. And that's one of the ways this information disappears. And this is, of course, far from the only example, but we at least have these. There are an uncountable number of gas masks and respirators from the last 150, 160 years that we don't even know exist. Here's another document that I want to show you. It's a municipal supplies catalog from the 1940s. I forget what year. But if you open it up to page 8, past the full visions, we get to this section. Now, I'm sure you can see why I bought it. It's because it's got covers stuff on it. But I want to focus on this thing right here. What the fuck is that? I don't know. You probably don't know. Everyone that remembers it is dead. The only reason we know this mask exists is because it's in this document. And all of the information we have about it is in this paragraph right here. We know that it cost $8.90 back in the 40s. We know the part number. It was arbitrarily assigned by the distributor. And outside of, again, what's right here, we know nothing. But like I said about the Potomac, at least we have this. And yeah, it's been some 80 years since this catalog was printed, but sometimes things get forgotten even quicker than that. I mentioned in my video on the corrected English that I wrote a whole book about World War I American filtering canisters. I had to do years of research. This was acquiring examples, reading through various documents, writing to my school library to have them send for a copy of a document from some other college's library. It was intensive. But not many documents were as helpful as the first-hand accounts produced right at the end of the war by the Chemical Warfare Service. But in one of them, admittedly, I forget which, the authors, who were high-ranking members of the Chemical Warfare Service, state that they don't know what the differences between the Navy Type A, B, and C canisters were. And over 100 years later, I still don't have an answer to that. I don't know what the difference is. I can theorize that it was the switch from the original soda lime to the, Astoria purple soda lime to the, A25B pink soda lime. I can hypothesize that, but I might never have an answer. Ultimately, I don't think this video is really about the Potomac. It will become about the Potomac in the next section, but ultimately, I kind of wanted to just talk about how history degrades incredibly quickly. And like I said earlier, this isn't specific to our little hobby of collecting gas masks. This is inherent to everything. The vast, vast majority of everything that has ever existed, everyone who has existed, and everything that has ever happened has been forgotten, and we will never know about it. And there is no solution to that. We cannot stop that. Even the things we learn and record today will be lost tomorrow. Libraries burn, documents get misplaced, and eventually, whether it be in a year or 1,000 years, YouTube will go out of business with the rest of Google. But with that brief aside concluded, why don't we get back to talking about this piece of shit? Starting off, these things are made out of both black and yellow rubber, although I don't know what this rubber is. It uses a twin lens design with rather unique rectangular eyepieces. The filters are also really interesting as they're mounted directly to the front of the facepiece. They are non-removable. Well, I'm sure you could remove them, but you're not supposed to. They are, of course, meant for all sorts of chemical and biological threats. The exhale valve and exhale valve guard are located on the right-hand side of the mask and are a rather typical design. Moving on, the Potomac uses a 5-point head harness that is riveted directly through the rubber of the harness tabs, making it non-removable. The head pad is a large, stretchy skull cap with one-time use only printed in large yellow letters on the back. Large parts of the head pad are dedicated to the loop part of the hook and loop fastener. That is because the chin strap uses the hooks, and that is the only way you can adjust the mask. That's all I want to say about the outside of the mask, so why don't we take a look inside? The interior is rather simple and pretty much self-explanatory, but we'll cover it anyway, starting with the peripheral seal. It's rather typical, being just a section of inverted rubber, and the chin cup is just the same. You'll notice that there is no inlet valve anywhere on this mask, which means that some amount of exhaled air will pass right back through the filters. Speaking of, there's your exhale valve. Again, like I said, it's rather typical. There's nothing really to comment on. Going back to the head harness for a second, there is a date stamp on it. It denotes this thing as having been manufactured on December 13 of 2002. What I think this means is that Helsatech was keeping these in storage after production, sometimes for years, and then shipping them off to a distributor. That's a very common thing among commercial mask manufacturers and dealers, so I don't think this is evidence that Elmridge was selling these things as early as 2002, especially since I have not seen any documentation that actually confirms that. Now we get to the question of why was the Potomac so goddamn awful? And for this explanation, I'm actually going to ignore the shockingly low quality of this thing. And that's partly because Duke already made that video, but I also think that it makes for a more interesting argument. So yeah, from this point forward, we're going to assume that the build quality isn't inherently sketchy. For this discussion, we are of course going to need to understand this mask's role. Specifically, this is a CBRN escape hood, or more accurately, a CB escape hood. For the purposes of this video, there are three main factors that make a good escape hood, Of course, it gets much more complicated than this in reality. It's just, this is a simplification of it. The first attribute is universality. This is the idea that anyone can wear it the moment they need to. This one is, to me, by far the most important for an escape hood. The second attribute is simplicity. You do not want your end user to waste valuable seconds fiddling with your mask for any longer than they have to. And the third and final attribute is cost effectiveness. That is, of course, the intersection of quality, effectiveness, and cost. And that's the one that we're going to be talking about the least, so I will actually start with that just to get it over with. As I said earlier, this thing is shockingly low quality. It's also incredibly simple. You'd think those facts would drive down the cost significantly, making this a very cheap option, but you need to remember that these were being imported from Germany and being sold by a distributor, so that drove up prices quite a bit. And so the Potomac wound up costing about $180 a unit. Moving on from cost effectiveness, let's talk about the topic of simplicity. As you saw during the overview portion of this video, it's pretty darn bare bones. There's not really anything that you can waste time on other than the straps. And I mean, having adjustable straps is important for universality. So that's a pretty clear W for the Potomac, right? Well, not exactly. Something that's very notable and was sacrificed for simplicity is any sort of oronasal cup. The purpose of an oronasal cup isn't just to prevent fogging in the mask, it's also there to reduce the amount of dead space. When you exhale, you release a bunch of carbon dioxide from your nose and mouth, and some of that will get trapped in the mask. So naturally, if you have some sort of dam blocking off the oronasal region of the face, that results in there being less carbon dioxide being trapped in the mask. And you definitely want that for, well, really any sort of application where you're going to be exerting yourself, because recirculating a significant amount of carbon dioxide is bad. Another thing the oronasal cup can do when present is actually add some structure to the mask. If you ever actually get your hands on one of these and try it on, one of the first things you'll notice is that the entire mask inflates and deflates when you breathe, like some sort of giant lung attached to your face. And I mean, it also fogs pretty severely and has no means of preventing or dissipating fog. So the big takeaway here is that while the end user won't struggle to put it on or adjust it or get it ready, but they will struggle with it in other ways. And an extension of that is these attributes I'm talking about aren't exactly a slider from good to bad. It's more complicated than that. You need to actually look at the context of the mask. And finally, let's talk about universality. Something that is actually quite unusual about this mask is that it is an escape hood. That is not a hood. Instead, it's a more traditional style of mask. And that actually leads to some pretty severe issues when it comes to universality. The whole point of an escape hood is for it to be able to be worn by anyone who would need to use it, without any sort of preparation. And there are a lot of different facial structures out there. Not only are there people with tiny heads like Tammy here, people with megamind-sized domes like myself, but there are people with intermediate, and all these people need a different size of mask. There are, of course, people with beards or particularly long hair, and much to the dismay of WC Gear, there are still people with cavernous temples. And that's why the term escape hood actually came about. Most modern escape hoods actually just circumvented this entire issue by having a hood that seals at the neck via some sort of dam. And for this reason, I am busting out the QuickPro. I personally believe that masks deserve to be judged and compared to their historical competition. And the QuickPro actually came out a few years before the Potomac, so I believe this is actually a fair comparison. What the QuickPro is just a Survivair 2000 series half-face mask with a hood built around it. On a side note, if you recognize the QuickPro, that's because the US military adopted a variant of it and designated it the M52 JSCESM. This is not that variant though. This is instead one with a hydration system, which I personally think is kind of silly. These things are meant to be worn for like 15 minutes max, so it's like, I don't know why this is necessary. Now, of course, the QuickPro is much less simple than the Potomac, as in it uses a 4-point head harness where all 4 straps are actually adjustable and it has an oronasal cup. But it has all of these features for what I think are very good reasons. You can see on the bottom that this thing seals with quite a large neck dam. And because of that, the QuickPro pulls off universality much, much better. And of course, any issues regarding simplicity can be abated through training. I think you guys probably get it by now, which is good because I've pretty much run out of things to say about the Potomac. It's pretty much just a low quality mask that doesn't perform particularly well in its intended role. And I mean, this video is kind of clickbaity. There are a lot of masks that are exactly like this, but this thing is just especially awful. But I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I certainly had fun making it. I've taken a bit of an interest in escape hoods lately, and I wanted to talk about one on the channel, so why not start out with, like, the worst one? If you like this sort of content and want to support it, I have a Ko-fi or Ko-fi, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, that you can see in the link tree in the description. But anyhow, thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one, whenever that is.
Stewie, you in there?
You think he's here?